students and teachers, and thank you, Nina, for inviting me over. I met Nina this summer in July. It was late July, and her husband and her young lads were travelling around Scotland in a nice little coach, and I was the driver, I was the guide, so I struck lucky on this one. All my driver guide friends in Scotland are very jealous, and I told them what I was doing. Now, I believe you all speak excellent English. You probably speak better English than me. I speak English with a Scottish accent. However, I've lived in Spain, I've lived in Turkey, I've travelled all over the world in previous careers, so I've learned to make myself understood. However, when I start talking about Scotland, and in particular, when I talk about battles, I am not talking about the battle, I am in the battle. So, I get excited, and I start speaking faster and faster and faster. Just say, Brian, slow down. Scotland is a country rich in history. Ever since time began, we've had invasions, a bit like the Czech Republic. We've had foreign invaders coming in. We had the Romans, we kicked them out. We had the Vikings, they lasted for 350 years, we kicked them out. We had the English. There's been great periods of Scottish history, the wars of independence. You've all seen the movie Braveheart. Well, that Braveheart movie is based on truth, but it's Hollywood. The real story of the Braveheart and the wars of independence is, I believe Pavine will tell you when I told the stories on my bus this year, far, far more interesting. But it's not about William Wallace, Mel Gibson, and the wars of independence, King Robert Bruce. This is about a period of Scottish history which is emotive, divisive. Even today, people are dying because what happened, we started in the year 1688. Northern Ireland, you've all heard about the troubles between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland. On the 12th of July every year, you'll see riots on your TV screens based in Northern Ireland. This was because of a man called William of Orange, the House of Orange in Holland. The Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution was when a Scottish king, King James VII of Scotland, was also King James II of England. He was the king of both countries, but he was a Catholic. Many, many people in England, there were far more millions of people in England than in Scotland. Many people in England had reformed to the new Protestant faith, and the Catholic king was unpopular. So they decided to get rid of him. There was a coup, led by his own daughter, Mary. That's family loyalty for you. She married a Dutchman, William of the House of Orange. They came over to Britain and overthrew her father. This was known as the Glorious Revolution. Scotland, England, Ireland will change to the new Protestant religion. They started off in Ireland, where King James would hold a rebel army against the new king. That was defeated at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. That's where they sing and they dance and they kill each other today in Northern Ireland about something that happened in 1690. Incredible. Get over it. Move on. But in Scotland there was great reaction to this glorious revolution. The Jacobite rebellions. The name Jacobites, where does it come from? Well, the name James, the king that was deposed, the name James in Latin is Jacobus. So they became Jacobites, supporters of King James. And there's the first rebellion. There were 4 rebellions. I will skirt over the first 3. I will tell you basically what happened, but then I will tell you in detail about the most famous rebellion, which culminated in the last battle ever to happen on British soil in the year 1746. Yes, you heard right. You know Britain is quite a warlike nation. There's wars all the time. We're always sticking our noses in here, there, and everywhere. But the last battle on British soil was in 1746. It's hard to believe, but it's true. And I will go into depth what happened at this battle. And what happened at this battle changed not only Scottish history, British history, but world history forever. First Jacobite rebellion, 1689, Battle of Palacký. Bonnie Dundee, the leader of the Jacobite forces, he came storming down the hill with his hairy Highlanders. Angry men, wanted to regain the throne for their king. There was a very inexperienced, quickly mustered regiment of redcoat soldiers, redcoat lowland Scotland soldiers. The Jacobite rebellions in Scotland, many people, even many English people today, are there any English in the audience? Come on, don't be shy. Okay. Many English people today still believe the Jacobite rebellion was a war between Scotland and England. No, it was a war between Catholic and Protestant. It was a civil war. There were just as many Scots fighting the Highlanders, the Jacobites, than English people. So the hairy Highlanders come running down the hill, chase them into the boggy marshy ground. There's a ravine, a gorge, and one terrified young redcoat soldier, a 19-year-old corporal. His musket powder is dry, it's gone, finished. And there's a big hairy Highlander coming towards him. He's terrified. Many of the men jump into the gorge, 155 feet down to their deaths. But this young corporal, he took an almighty breath and he ran for his life. And he leapt off a stone, and he leapt 19 feet over and survived. Managed to grab onto a branch and survived. That's now a place now known as Soldiers' Leap at Palacký. And it's a place of the only static bungee jump now in Scotland. So you can emulate what happened to these men. Bonnie Dundee, the commander of the Jacobite forces, he died with wounds sustained in the battle. His body was taken to Blair Castle for preparation for burial. They took off his armour, and they were shocked to see what they found in his tunic, under his armour, an emblem of the Knights of the Templar. Have you heard of the Knights of the Templar? Warrior monks. They would protect the route from Europe to the Holy Lands. There was only meant to be 9-10 Knights of the Templar, try more like 900. They were excommunicated from the Pope in Rome. Why? Because they became so wealthy. They became so wealthy that the King of France, he was jealous of their wealth. The Pope of Rome was in the pocket of the King of France, and he ordered the Pope to excommunicate the Knights of the Templar. In the year 1307, Friday the 13th, Black Friday, for 400 Knights of the Templar were rounded up and burned alive at the stake. The treasure confiscated. Where were the other 500 going to go? There was only one place they could go. Scotland. Why? The whole country of Scotland was excommunicated by the Pope in Rome. Why? For the King of Scots, King Robert the Bruce, had committed a heinous act of murder in the house of God. He murdered his enemy in the Roman Catholic Church. So the whole of Scotland was excommunicated. 3 weeks later, after Palacký, the Battle of Dunkeld. Complete and utter wipeouts. I believe you've seen the posters. The posters of tonight's event. If you look at the picture of the redcoat soldiers fighting the Jacobite warriors, that was actually depicted in the Battle of Dunkeld. It was a complete and utter wipeout. That was that Jacobite rebellion over. The second, 1715, a one-man show. Very, very poor show. Rob Roy McGregor. Has anyone seen the movie Rob Roy? Liam Neeson, very good film. Once again, totally historically inaccurate, but good film. Well, Rob Roy McGregor took his McGregor men to the Battle of Sheriffmuir, but he watched each side. There was going to be a draw. In those days, the Highland clans, the ones that didn't actually pick a side, they stood there and watched, and the Highland clan, or whoever was actually winning, gaining momentum, the independent man would join them and get the glory for that. So that was the Battle of Sheriffmuir, Second Jacobite Rebellion, finished. The penultimate, 1719, Spanish were involved. 4 tons of explosives would make their way up to Donning Castle near the Isle of Skye. There were 7,000 Spanish soldiers willing to regain the throne for King James, the Catholic king. The terrible weather had played a part. You've all heard about the terrible Scottish weather. More about that tomorrow for those of you that are coming to the show tomorrow. Only 79 arrived intact with 4 tons of explosives. The Highland Army, on hearing of 7,000 men, were delighted. Yes, let's get at them. They arrived at a place called Glen Shield, near the Isle of Skye. They seen the Spanish coming towards them. Buenos dias. What are you? Where's the rest of you? Didn't arrive. Where've they gone? Oh, that terrible Scottish weather drove them back. You mean there's 79 of you? 79? And we've only got a couple of thousand? You've got 4,000 British troops arriving around the corner. What are we going to do? Wait for them. The 4,000 British troops did arrive, and it was a complete and utter annihilation once again. When's this battle going to... When is this Jacobite rebellion? When is there going to be a victory? Another 26 years until they had to bottle the guts to try something else. James II of England, 7th of Scotland. He was exiled to France and then on to northern Italy, where he had a son, then a grandson. This grandson's name was Charles Edward Stuart, later to be known as Bonnie Prince Charlie. As a young boy, he would sit on his grandfather's knee, and his grandfather would wax lyrical about this exotic land called Scotland, a land in which one day he should be king. A young teenage boy, full of testosterone, full of fights and anger. He made his way to France, and he would befriend his first cousin, King Louis. He'd ask King Louis for help. There were already 10,000 French troops at the ports of Dunkirk. As the weather would have it again, the weather closed in. The British Navy surrounded Dunkirk and destroyed the 10,000 troops. Jeez. It's a joke. He asked again for more help from King Louis. King Louis says, but I do not know. I am skint. I have spent too much money on the Palace of Versailles and all these places. I'm skint. But he did promise them, if he started a rebellion in Scotland, and they made their way down into England to take London, then he would support them with another 10,000 French troops from the south. This was enough for Bonnie Prince Charlie, Charles Edward Stuart. He sold everything his family had, land, title, jewels. Enough money to buy 2 ships. One, a French man of war, the Elizabeth. This would be packed with explosives, packed with guns, ammunition, and 700 French mercenaries. Another small ship, a fast-moving schooner called the Display. July 1745, they set sail from the west coast of France at Le Havre, and they made their way up the west of England in the Irish Sea. They were met by an English man of war. The English man of war opened fire. For 5 hours, or should I say not English, British. See, I'm Scottish. I am Scottish, well I am British by an act of birth. The whole island of Britain, including Scotland. I am British by birth, but I am Scottish by the grace of God. So, the British Navy, they opened fire on the Elizabeth. For 5 hours, both ships bombarded each other, bang, 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 until both ships were rendered useless, and they had to return to their various ports. Bonnie Prince Charlie was devastated, absolutely devastated. But still, he carried on to the west coast of Scotland. He landed on an island called Palacký. They do nice whiskey there. But he was met with a chieftain of a sect of the clan MacDonald. The chieftain heard that there was rumours of a landing. He recognised the young prince immediately because he had the look of his grandfather. The chieftain said to the young laddie, "Go home, son, there's nothing for ye here." But the prince replied in his best Italian, French, Scots, Gaelic accent, "But sir, I am home." He asked the chieftain to send word to the mainland. See if the clans had stomach for a rising. He said he would send word to the mainland, but he did not believe that there would be stomach for a rising, for there were still hangings, beheadings, imprisonments going on from the previous rebellion 26 years before. But the bonny prince, he believed there's a new generation of young Highlanders. A generation of young Highlandmen willing to avenge their fathers and their grandfathers. 2 days later, the prince sailed over to a place called Lochshiel. He ordered his ship to leave the Tuscany to go. This was his only means of escape. For the last 7 miles down Lochshiel, he and his 7 accomplices. On that ship, there was only 7 men to start the rebellion. He was so confident the clans would rise. For 7 miles, they rowed along the loch and landed in a place called Glenfinnan. Glenfinnan, you will know better as the place where the Harry Potter viaduct is. You know the train going over the bridge? Yeah. That's Glenfinnan. The prince arrived August the 3rd, 1745. There was no one there apart from the 200 members of the MacDonald's escape. The prince was devastated. You cannot start the rebellion with 200 men, never mind to take over a country. It was a rebellion in the eyes of the British. It was a rising if you were a Scot or a Jacobite. His head in his hands that evening, wondering what would become of him. Surely words had reached the soldiers, the Red Coat soldiers at Fort William, that all would be lost, that the prince has landed, the young pretender to the throne. His head in his hands, there's a slight breeze in the wind. He thought he heard a distant sound. Bagpipes. Getting louder. And he looked through one of the glens, and he could see hundreds, if not thousands of Highlanders screaming, cheering down the glen, playing the pipes, their battle tunes. The rebellion was on. Their Farquharses, MacDonalds, Mackays, Donahues, Robertsons, and many more clans would join them as they moved south. They did move south, meeting and through Stirling, Falkirk, and on to the streets of Edinburgh. But the people of Edinburgh panicked. The Highland army was descending upon them. What would happen to them? For the people of Edinburgh they were genteel folk. They had never seen a Highlander. The Highlands were only 40 miles away, but they had never seen one. They had just heard of them. They were frightened to build outside the city walls. They heard of the Highland army, but there was a curiosity. They'd heard of rumours of the Bonnie Prince. Why was he called Bonnie Prince Charlie? Well, Bonnie, in the English, well, it's not even an English name. Bonnie is a Scottish name, which means pretty, nice. It's normally used for a baby. A baby or a girl, Bonnie Lassie. Not a man. Bonnie Prince Charlie, what does that tell you? The reason he was called Bonnie Prince Charlie was he was an aristocrat. And he wore makeup. Now you've seen all the old pictures, the paintings. They have white powder faces and red lipstick and little beauty marks. The big Highland women, the big fisherwomen, had never seen a man wearing makeup before, and having a wig. So they called him Bonnie Prince Charlie. People of Edinburgh, excited but terrified. I cannot actually understand that they're feeling. I'm not sure if you're aware, but this time next year, we'll know if Scotland will be an independent country or not. We've got a referendum going on. More about that tomorrow, and they'll be answering questions about that tomorrow as well. So, once again, an exciting but terrifying time as well. So, the people of Edinburgh. Close the doors! The city guard will save us! But sir, there are only 4 city guards left. Then the dragoons in the castle will save us. But sir, the dragoons have locked themselves in the castle. They're terrified. We must send out for help. They knew the Highland army was outside, but they did not know where. Late in the evening, the doors of the gate opened, and the messenger was sent out to call for the dragoons, British soldiers. At 3 o'clock in the morning, a knock came on the door. At the back, they opened the door. But they did not realise the Cameronians were lying in wait, and the Cameronians would pile into the city, up the Royal Mile of Edinburgh. But instead of being met with fire and sword and bloodshed, they were met with wine, whiskey and song. The men were out with bottles of wine and whiskey, welcoming the Highland army. The bonny lassies would welcome them themselves, whilst leaning out of the windows in their own special way. It was incredible. The city of Edinburgh was taken without one drop of blood shed. Bonnie Prince Charlie, Charles Edward Stewart, enjoyed himself in Edinburgh. He was having it was great. Parties, good fun. It was here where he proclaimed his father, King James VIII of Scotland and 3rd of England. But there was a huge British army amassing themselves east of Edinburgh. The British army was led by a man called Johnny Cope, finest general. He sent Bonnie Prince Charlie a letter. Come send a challenge from them bar, say Charlie meet me if you know, and I'll give you a lesson in the art of war if you meet me in the morning. When Charlie looked the letter upon, he drew his sword and scarred from, say follow men me. My merry men will meet Johnny Cope in the morning. You notice the dagger here? It's wooden. It's a bit annoying because I have the real knife. These guys here, you seen the big swords? I have those swords, but can you believe it? They wouldn't allow me at the airport to bring them through. It's only that size. It's only, you know, it's a bit strict. Come on. So I have to do with wood. So Bonnie Prince Charlie, he informed the Highland chiefs of this letter. The Highlanders were not a proper organised army. It's not like you have a general in your country, he would tell the captains what to do and this, that and the other. No, the Highland chiefs spoke for themselves. They did not follow anyone. They could follow Bonnie Prince Charlie if they chose to. The Highland chiefs did what they wanted. He could only advise. Bonnie Prince Charlie says, yes, we'll meet Johnny Cope in the morning. But the Highland chiefs, they were thirsty for British blood. They had not tasted British blood for at least 10 days. They wanted more. So the Highlanders streamed out of the city towards a place called Preston Pans, early in the morning, as the dozy, sleeping British army. There was a field, a boggy marsh. There was mist around this field. The Highland army completely surrounded the redcoats. And these men started to move towards them faster and faster, stronger and stronger. And they started to scream and call on their ancestors for help in battle. If ever you've seen the movies and you've seen the Highlands Charge, the famous Scottish Highland Charge, Highlander would charge the enemy, okay? They make as much noise as they can when they're doing the charge. They were invincible, they were terrifying at close quarters. So the British had to stop them if they could. For once the Highlander was upon you, there was only one winner. For when they attacked you, if there was a line of redcoats there, you've probably seen in the movie there, there's a point here. They would just pierce the enemy, and they would not notice this knife here. It would probably only be sticking about there. They'd pierce and then cut down. Cut the tendon at the top of the leg. The enemy did not know about this. They were too worried about this. Pierce. Simple. They were terrifying. But when the Highlander was upon you, you might think, in the movies, yeah! They're not, they're actually calling on their ancestors. My name is Brian. My father's name is James. My grandfather's name is Oni, and my great-grandfather's name is Alec. So I would call Brian, son of James, son of Oni, son of Val. Brian, son of James, son of Oni. And fast, call on the strength of your ancestors. But I would say it in the old Gaelic way. The name, you probably noticed many names in Scotland is Mick or Mac, M-A-C, M small c, MacDonald. You all know McDonald's, don't you? Okay. So, I would say Brian, MacJames, MacConey, MacCallan. Brian, MacJames, MacConey, MacCallan. Brian, MacJames, and it just terrified the living daylights out of the enemy. Battle of Preston Pans was an absolute whitewash. It was complete annihilation. Johnny Cope fled in his horse. This invincible redcoat soldier, he fled with his horse over the border into England. It was only then that the British royal family, I say British royal family loosely, began to take this rebellion like one that could go all the way. The king at the time was King George of the House of Hanover, Germany. The British would put a German king who could not speak any English whatsoever on the throne of Britain because he was a Protestant. He was 57th in line to the throne, and he was the first suitable king. Boniface Charlie, second in line to the throne, but because he was Catholic. So this was not about Scotland and England, this was about Catholic and Protestant. So they began to get ready to flee. The main crux of the British Army had gone, but there were men apparently on their way home from the wars in the Americas. The Highland Army, they flew over the border, still meeting and defeating all who stood in their way, through Hexham, Carlisle, Cumbria, and through Manchester, where they were joined by 200 members of the Manchester Regiment. Yes, Manchester, that's in England. English Jacobites. There was a further promise of another 3,000 English Jacobites down closer to London. They left Manchester through Derby, through Sheffield, and on to a place called Derby, 110 miles from London. This is where Boniface Charlie would hold his council of war. He decided to reward his men. This was his biggest mistake. For Boniface Charlie did not understand the Highlands psyche, the way the men thought. Also, there were rumours coming out from spies. There were very many spies, double agents. One such double agent was a man called Daniel Defoe. Has anyone heard of Daniel Defoe? Well, he wrote a story about another Scottish man called Alexander Selkirk, who was Robinson Crusoe. That's a true story. foot soldiers, we'll get rid of them, no problem. We'll take the losses on our charge. We'll take the gunfire. Come on, bring it on. But once we're upon them, boom, that's it, we're through. Bonnie Prince Charlie. Bring up the chest of gold. He summoned the Highland chiefs. Distribute the money, the gold amongst your men. The lowest of the low, the poorest of the poorest Highlander must receive his fair share of gold. Great. Nobody's going to refuse free money. Wow. Great. Later on that evening, where's all the men? Gone. There were 9,000 men in Derby. By the early evening, there was less than 2,000 left. Yet gone. Not because they were cowards, not because they were taking the money and run, because the Highland psyche, you only get paid when the job is done. A satisfactory job, that is when you get paid. These men weren't educated. Great money, let's go. They went to save the money away for a rainy day. The very act of saving the money for a rainy day caused the rainy day. Arguments amongst the chiefs. Who was to blame for all this? But there was no alternative. They had to make their way back to Scotland. With the best will in the world, 2,000 Highlanders could not take on 10,000 redcoats. The best will in the world could not take a city the size of London. Charlie, throughout the campaign, he led from the front, sitting on his horse, tall, proud. On the way back, he sidled up in a carriage, a shadow of his former self. But still the Highlanders, only 2,000 of them, they would still meet and defeat anything that came in their way. But this gave the British Army a chance to galvanise. More soldiers arrived back from the Americas. They started a campaign of scorched earth. Wherever the Highlanders would go, food, grain would be burnt, would be removed. The Highland Army began to starve. Where were the 3,000 English Jacobites? Where were the 10,000 French? The French did send aid with regards to ships of the North Sea and the Irish Sea, but these ships were blockaded. The ships had food, ammunition. These ships were blockaded or sunk. The Highland Army crossed the border, happy to be on Scottish soil, still meeting and defeating all, until they gathered just outside Inverness at a place called Culloden Moor, which would be the last battle on British soil. It was 4 a.m. in the morning when the Highlanders gathered. They tried a campaign where they would try and attack the English or the British overnight. But it was wet, it was rainy, it was dark, it was through the forest. It was a shambles. So they had walked for hundreds of miles over the last few months. And they gathered on Culloden Moor, April the 16th, 1746. 4 a.m., windy, horrible. Very bad. They were starving, they were cold, they were hungry, their feet were red raw with blisters. They were exhausted. Some of these men were 12 years old. And they waited for 7 hours before the British arrived. Up in the field. 4 times the number. With a fine artillery, the flags waving in the wind. They were in good spirits, for they had just received, the night before, they had just received a flagon of ale each, or some brandy, for it was the commander's birthday. The commander was the Duke of Cumberland, grandson of the king. And he said that today there will be no quarter asked or given. 1746, April the 16th, 1 p.m. The first shot from the Scottish artillery was fired. It fell woefully short of the British lines. The British stayed further back than they normally would for a charge, a Highland charge. There's a very good reason for this, to be explained later on. The fire from the Scottish lines opened up fire from the British lines. Boom, 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 boom. And for 15 minutes, the British cannon fired through the Highlanders waiting for a charge, an order for a charge. The order did not come. They stood there and took the cannonball. See, at first, there was no grape shot. It was just pure cannonball, pure iron balls. And they would fire and they'd take the head right off you. You'd stand there as your son, your father, your brother. The head would be taken right off him. 800 died as they stood. 800 died as they stood waiting on the order to charge. Full of frustration and anger, the charge was ordered by the chief of my clan, the Clan Robertson, and the Clan McGilvery's. And they charged onto the field of battle. Everyone else believed that this was an official charge. They went onto the field of battle. Immediately, there's problems to the left. The MacDonalds. He stood still. Stood still. What's up with them? They refused to charge. Why? They spat their dummy out, their pacifier out. They weren't given the line of honour. To be placed on the left was a line of dishonour. Bonnie Prince Charlie didn't know this. He didn't understand the Highland psyche. He just said, you stand there. They didn't say anything, he just stood there. It was a place of dishonour. They hadn't done anything to warrant this. And none of the other clan chiefs would say anything, because they didn't want to be put there. So the MacDonalds stood there and waited for another 3 minutes before they would charge. They would charge as well. The Highland army charged, screaming like banshees. Collie, Right, soldiers, ready? Aim. Maybe 150 would fall. Accepted losses, and still they charged, getting faster and faster. The land was boggy, wet, marshy, slimy, muddy. It wasn't a good place for a battlefield. We should never have fought the battle there. We should have fought the battle in the mountains, in the hills, in the river. Warfare, the Highland way. That way we would have stood a chance. 150 fall. And still they would move further along the field. The MacDonalds then realised they're in boggy ground, terrible ground, so they moved towards the centre. This bunches them up with the Macintoshes, easier targets. You didn't even need to aim. Second round of fire. Ready, aim. Maybe 250 would fall. And still they would charge further and further. Now, they only ever had 2 rounds of musket fire against them in any charge before. And that was it. Right, okay, that's it. I've survived the musket. Bring it on. Yeah! Then they couldn't believe their eyes. Ready? Aim. That's why they were further back. It bought them time. The redcoats were trained to repowder, reload with ball bearings into their muskets. Ready? Aim. Maybe 600 would fall in the last moments. But still, they broke through, pushing, cutting, slashing, pushing, cutting, slashing, pushing, cutting. But there's a first, they broke through 1 line, 2 lines, then a 3rd line, but there's a 4th, a 5th, and a 6th. And a further battalion of British soldiers down the field. The British, there were far too many. The Highlanders had to retreat, and they would come away from the battlefield. And here is where one of the most despicable acts of the battle occurred. The hated Campbell clan. The Campbells had always fought with the British or the English before we became a united country. They were the first to nail the mast to the new Protestant religion. Everyone hated the Campbells. stood from behind the wall and they shot fleeing Highlanders in the back. There was 1,600 Highlanders killed in this battle and 52 British. It was so one-sided, it was unbelievable. Just for one simple reason: the arrogance of Bonnie Prince Charlie. But they'd fallen blindly. The clansmen would follow the chief, and as the chief chose to follow Bonnie Prince Charlie, that was it. No quarter was to be given. Every man and boy in the field who was wounded would be bayoneted. I mentioned earlier on about the referendum that's going on next year, and one of the people supporting the No campaign, in their arrogance, said that, oh yes, after they vote No, there'll be a lot of bayoneting needed to go on. That touched a raw nerve, and there was a lot of anger about that. So they're bayoneted, they're killed. Around 30 of these men survived. They crawled into a hut which is still on the field today. For 3 days they were licking their wounds when the redcoats burst in and caught them. Expecting to be taken out and hanged. The door was locked, it was barricaded up. They heard the crackling and then they smelled the smoke as they were burned alive inside the building. That was only the start. There would be terrible retribution. The Highlanders had come so close to overthrowing London that it would never happen again. The Highlands will never rise again. So there would be a period in Scotland known as the Highland Clearances. You might know it better as ethnic cleansing. The Highlanders fleeing the battle. They go all over the place. They try and go back to their glens, their valleys, to see their families, their parents, their children, their siblings that they had not seen for months. And certainly find their families hanging from the local trees or lying dead. The new law: if you wore tartan, you would be killed. If you spoke the indigenous language of Gaelic, the only language which most of them knew, you would be killed. If you played the offensive weapon known as the bagpipes, you were to be killed. Now if you take away someone's language, someone's clothing and someone's music, there's only one phrase that springs to mind: ethnic cleansing. It got even further, deeper later, I think, in the years to follow. More about that later on tonight. The Highlanders would flee. Bonnie Prince Charlie would flee. Many arrived at a place called Riven Barracks. Were you there? Riven Barracks? Yeah. Many Highlanders would gather at Riven Barracks. A redcoat barracks in which they took on the way to Culloden. When they heard news from Bonnie Prince Charlie that he had escaped to France, with the word that every man was for himself. The men went home to the valleys to find the terrible retribution. There were many heroes which helped Bonnie Prince Charlie escape. One such hero was a young man called Roderick Mackenzie. He was an Edinburgh goldsmith. He was taken away by the fervour and excitement of it all when the Highland clans came into Edinburgh. He went as far as Derby and then the return to Culloden Moor. He was told throughout the campaign that he looked so much like the Bonnie Prince. It could be twins, it could be brothers. As he was fleeing along Glenmoriston, redcoat soldiers came upon him, and he was shot from a distance in the shoulder, and he fell, knowing that he could not outrun the redcoat soldiers. As the redcoats came upon him, he heard the words of many people saying that he looked like the Bonnie Prince. And as £30,000 reward on the head of Bonnie Prince Charlie. That's over £1 million in today's money. These redcoat soldiers had just won the lottery. Yes! Boom! They cut off the head of Roddy Mackenzie. And for 3 days they marched down to Fort William to claim their prize. Word had spread around the Highlands like wildfire. Bonnie Prince Charlie himself heard the rumour that he had been caught. He thanked the young lad in his prayers, for this bought him 3 days of time. They went to Fort William to claim their prize, and they were ridiculed. They were mocked, they were laughed at. That's not him, don't be ridiculous. He has a mole here. Oh, he said it was him. They were humiliated. So these redcoat soldiers would return to Glenmorrison, just on the banks of Loch Ness, and they would put every man, woman and child to the sword that they could find, regardless of whether they took part in the Highland Rebellion. Bonnie Prince Charlie, a bit of a character. He fled to France and he died an alcoholic at the age of 67. He went over to a place called Skye. He was helped by another heroine, a lady called Flora MacDonald. She would dress him up as her servant maid Betty Burke, and she would row him over with her friends. 22 miles from the Outer Hebrides to the Isle of Skye. Speed bonny boat like a bird on the wind, onward the sailors cry. Carry the lad who was born to be king over the sea to Skye. Flora MacDonald was arrested after the campaign. She was taken down to London. She would be held for treason. If she was found guilty, then she would be one of the last women in Britain to be beheaded. There was huge excitement about this trial. Everybody wanted to be there. It was the best ticket in town. As Miss MacDonald was in prison, she would have visitors, the fine ladies of London society, for they had never heard of a heroine before. It was always heroes, it was always men. A heroine, wow! You tell them, how did you rescue your prince, you know? The trial came, and the king himself was fascinated. And he cross-examined Flora MacDonald. He said, well, why, Miss MacDonald, why did you help the young pretender to the throne? But she knew the prince liked his ladies, and she was a bonny lassie. And she used her womanly ways, and she fluttered her eyelashes at him. But sire, if you were in trouble, I would help you as well. Case dismissed. Huge cheers from the audience. Flora MacDonald was the darling of society. She was the first on anybody's dinner party list. She enjoyed the time. She met a redcoat soldier and she moved over to the Carolinas in North America. Trouble seemed to follow Flora wherever she went. She was embroiled in the American War of Independence, and she eventually came back to Scotland, where she now rests on the Isle of Skye. Now, I told you earlier on that the Highlanders were the Highland Tartars band. This lasted for 40 years. 40 years. Oh, I thought you were coming to the front. I thought you wanted to get with you. You can come back, it's okay. It's okay, I won't take it personally. So the Highlanders. Tartars band. 1820. Sir Walter Scott. He was advised by the King George, that he would visit Edinburgh. You have 2 weeks to organise a visit. Sir Walter Scott, excited by this. He knew King George was fascinated by the old Highland ways. And he asked 4 Highland chiefs to arrive in Edinburgh. And wear your finest Highland wear. Don't be ridiculous. We'll be killed, we'll be imprisoned, whatever. No, trust me. Wear your finest Highland wear. The Highland chiefs arrived in Edinburgh, nervous. They were scorned upon. These king arrived in his carriage. As he emerged from his carriage, bedecked from head to toe in royal Stuart tartan. From that moment on, tartan was then a common wear. This kilt, this is what I'm wearing just now, this is a modern version. When I say modern version, about 200 years old. But many English people would say, oh, this kilt's not traditionally Scottish, it's only 200 years old. When does tradition begin? If you go on holiday for 3 years in the same place, every single year, you've created a tradition. This is 200 years old. But this is not the original wear. This was what was worn after 1820. The Highland, there was no such thing as clan tartans. Do you know what clan is? A clan is an extended family. Clan, the word in Gaelic, actually means child. So the clans would all work and live together. They'd marry within the clan most of the time. It depends. They'd marry out with the clan if they wanted to strengthen the bonds. So, see, we were quite a bloodthirsty race. If we didn't have the English to fight, or the Irish even, we'd fight each other. You know, so it's quite a bloodthirsty race. So they'd try and make the clan stronger by intermarriages. I'll tell you a story about that later on. So, initially, the Highlander would wear a tartan plaid. Tartan plaid. This was 7 metres long by 1.5 metres wide. Okay? And the Highlander would be naked underneath and he would dress himself. Can I have a volunteer to get naked and dress themselves on board on stage here? Come on, you know you want to. Right. Well, I'll tell you what, you don't have to get naked, but taking your trousers off would be helpful. Okay. I'm going to dress someone up in the tartan plaid. If you would allow me to. Now the men and women would both have similar garments, worn slightly different. This is why my wife never allows me to make the bed. Just talk amongst yourselves. This is all a Highlander wear. Now you notice the colours are basically taken from the dyes of the hills, the heather, the plants. The more colourful tartans were actually only the rich, the clan chiefs could wear those. And the reason for that is it was imported dye from India, from Europe, etc. So these were very good for camouflage in the hills as well. So, what do I need to do here? I think I should make some pleats, don't you? Have I got any volunteers? Well done, that man! Well done, that man, okay. That's good. Are you willing to get naked? No. Willing to take your trousers off? Okay. We'll see. Okay, right. Now the Highlanders would they would wash this once a year, whether it was needed to or not. Okay. And the way they would do this, it's very difficult to do on carpet. The way they do this is a week before it was needed to wash, they would gather rainwater in a barrel, a cask. And a few days before, they would all urinate in that cask. They would pee in it. Very fine. And overnight, these these plaids would be soaked in the water and the urine, and the urine would actually kill all the parasites. So it made sense. The next day they dry it up. Remember, there's no comforts, there's no Febreze softener or anything like that. So they just make sure it was dried out and then they would wear it. Now you think, well, how's he going to cool a girl with that? How's he going to get a mate or whatever? The girls did the exact same. Everybody smelled the same. So these films, the notions of a romantic Highland warrior, they were all stinking. They had rotten teeth and bad breath. It was off. Yeah. So, but hey, that's Hollywood for you. It's actually very difficult on this carpet. Now you'd use this as your clothing, you'd use this as a sleeping blanket because the water would not penetrate, it would be waterproof. So the other side would be dry, so you'd take it off when you're in the hills and you'd sleep it, be like your blanket. And it would also be a mode of transportation. You could create pockets, huge pockets, and you could carry huge amounts of weight. The Highlanders moved very, very quickly over the highlands, over the hills and the rivers, etc. And that was a difference. That's why they had the advantage. That's why they should have used the hills, the forests. Right, okay. Right. There we go. Right, sir. Would you like to come over, please? Right, now, you're a bit a tall lad, so it just, I couldn't have done it, I should have done it this way to show people, but you're going to have to face with your head there, your bum, oh yeah, that's a Scottish accent, where did you get that? Right, you put your bum there and you're facing that way. So you're like, right. Head there, feet there. Right, let's see now. Okay, fine. Okay, smashing. Right, okay. Right, there, up there, lovely. Yeah, right. battle. We've got a long journey.
Bring it.
Bring it on. Yes. Okay. So now I need to get this here and here. Hold that. And then this over here. Hold that for me. You've been learning Scottish all week, haven't you? Right. There you go. How about that? Turn around, show them. Turn around. There you go. Right, okay. It's not quite round. I'm not happy with it. Well, tell you what, you need maybe a good long journey. Perhaps you need to make a belt, you need to make a pocket. Yeah, a pocket, yeah. Just tiny bit in the belt.
Like that?
Yeah, and that's it. You can carry a fish. You've maybe just caught a salmon. Oh, sorry. So you can put all sorts in there. Lovely. Okay, right. Let's see now.
Give me the big one.
You left-handed, right-handed?
Right-handed.
Right-handed. Okay, so you want to. Okay. Yes. That's right then. Let's see. Now maybe when we battle, we need a sword. Yeah, we need a sword. This way. This way. Right, we need to. Show us with it. Right, lovely. I'll give you a. There we go. Lovely. Yeah, smash it. Yeah, duck. Please hold that. There. That's right. One other thing, not quite right yet. So lovely here, isn't it? Lovely here. Now the clans did not have clan tartans until after about 1820. So the clans would be identified. There were tartans. But they'd signify areas, like the Isle of Skye or the Hebrides. But they would wear clans. This is the Hay clan plant. My clan would be a fern. So you'd be recognised by the plant in your bonnet, your hat. So, right. Now, sad excuse, isn't it? My sword is this length. It's not a huge basket handle. Now, when you go in and there's none of this. That's none of this. It was packing. So, it had a basket here. Metal basket. So when you were too close, it would be like that, or right, simple as that. There you go. Right. Right, I'll tell you what, I've got a stick. Okay, right. Right, come on. No, say I'm a Red Coat soldier. This is a bayonet at the end of a musket. Come at me. Right, you do this, you push this to the side, like that, and then you tap me down. And as you push me to the side, you go down like that, and then you tap me like that. And you say like this. So the Highlanders would be terrifying at close quarters, but the British I have no clue what time it was. The British studied this. They said, we've got to cope with this, because when they will break through. So they were like this, terrified. So, the British were told not to take on the man facing you, take on him. But when you raise your sword, if you're taking on my friend here, you raise your sword like this, you're taking on him. So I would be like this. So, should we see if that works? Bonnie Lassie. We already got a volunteer. Nicole? There we go. Now I don't have the big thing, the dress thing, but I'll get dressed up in the plaid. Okay, it's very, very simple. Very, very simple, very nice. It's not a violent one, it's very nice and sweet. So, would you like to move over there? Sorry, what's your name? No, Young, it's a Scottish name. Oh, Jan.
Jan.
Oh, Jan. Oh, yeah, but it says young as an N. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. You need to get a bit more growth. Come on. Be a bit.
Next time.
There we go. So this is the female version. Not a lot to it. Now the female would wear like a big nightie, a sort of nightie that your grandmother would wear. You know, a big white nightie. And that's what they would wear. Nothing underneath. They'd be naked underneath. That's what they would wear from May right through to September in the Highlands. So it was quite tough. And then from October through to start of May again, they would wear this. Facing that way. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so this is going, your waist is going to be here. No, sorry, the other way. Your head's here. Head's here, your waist is here. Up with it. Fantastic. Lovely, lovely. No looking up my coat. I'll explain my dress tomorrow. I'll make it safe for time. Occasionally you want to go to a party. You're invited to a party. So you'd want to dress like that. And just up there. Up like that. And you would be ready for a party. There, as simple as that. You've answered, right, okay. Right, maybe you want to put your shorts, your weapons down, and you can have a wee dance. Right. Okay, it's a Collie. A Collie is a Scottish dance. Right, no, that's okay. You can, just in case you get invaded by the party. You never know. You take somebody's woman. Right, you face this way. Okay, okay. Just hold hands like that. No, just one. And the other hand in the air. Okay, right, spin. 1, 2, 3. And turn. The other way. Change hands and go. Step we go. Here's the green top. Give them a round of applause. real for £50. Don't do it. It's cheap rubbish. It's like your granny's tablecloth. You know, you cannot do it. A real kilt, minimum you should pay is £250, and that's a second-hand one. Okay, so there's 8 metres of wool in this. You go up with that. There you go. And, sorry? You go naked? Right, thanks very much. Thank you. Excellent. So, right, what do we add here for? So you want, okay, right, okay. Well, thanks, guys, for coming. Tomorrow morning we're going to be doing another session, mainly in the Highlands and Islands. But it's going to incorporate all things Scottish. If you have any questions, particularly on the referendum that's coming up, Scottish politics, but about the formation of Scotland, the clan system, other historical aspects, the beautiful places that you might want to go and visit, the lovely Isle of Skye, etc. Please think of your questions for tomorrow. Has anyone got any questions at the moment? I will answer all questions truthfully to the best of my knowledge, apart from what am I wearing under my kilt.
Is there some degeneration within the class when you just marry within the class?
Sorry?
Is there some degeneration or some blue destroyer or if you just marry within some group?
Yes,
Is there some visible some?
Yeah, you would normally marry within your group, within your clan, unless it was a marriage of convenience to strengthen a clan. There were a lot of feuding, a lot of fighting, a lot of killing before people would agree to marry within another clansman. A girl would be betrothed, and then the girl would beg her father not to go ahead with the wedding, and the father would eventually agree. He loved his girl, and then but his whole clan would be wiped out by the opposing clan the next week because he agreed to a wedding that was not suitable.
Yeah, but the genes, wouldn't they degenerate if there were, marriages within the same?
Yes, of course. Sorry, yes, of course. It's like you have people all over the world now. The clans are dispersed, and they're not the people from America, Canada. They're more Scottish than Scottish people. Even though if you look at their genes, they look at the DNA. There's very, very little there. But yes, the clan system now. There's very little strength there. It's mainly tradition, more than anything else, I would say.
So, as Brian advertised already, we can continue on the Scottish matters tomorrow morning. So, everyone is cordially invited to the morning session that starts actually at 8 o'clock. And it will take place in this auditorium. So there is a change of place from room 15 because it will be crowded to the aula. And let me thank on behalf of the project team members Brian for this wonderful evening, and please give him a big round of applause.